Hi there, Rachel Chase here, and in this video we will explore estimates and sample sizes, specifically how we can use confidence intervals to estimate information about a population. Before we begin, let's talk about the big picture. Confidence intervals are a technique that we use in statistics when population data is generally unavailable. In the real world, you have to consider the fact that it's very unlikely, for usually financial or even just time constraints, to be able to find out data about a population without some type of perhaps technology. Now, more realistically, we're likely to have sample data because if you're dealing with a population that is quite massive, the best approach would be to take a sample. Now, let's talk about what a confidence interval is. Since a confidence interval is a way to estimate what's happening with a population, we have two different things that we could use confidence intervals for. First and foremost, you could use it to deal with proportions. Now, proportion data we haven't dealt much with, but this is when you have something that is qualitative, and we'll end up doing that last. It's much easier from my perspective to explain in terms of means and standard deviations because we've been doing this for a long time already. And then for quantitative data, we use confidence intervals for estimating population means. So let's go ahead and take a look at some vocabulary, and then the next video will explore actually computing these things. A point estimate is a singular value used to approximate the population parameter. So if you recall from our vocab chapter back in 1, we talked about parameter being some type of data or statistics about a population. So a point estimate is how we approximate what's going on. If you're dealing with a proportion, your point estimate would be, we call it p hat, because this is a sample proportion. Similarly, if you're dealing with means, you would use x bar because this is a sample mean. So essentially we're saying that you are using that sample information plus or minus some type of margin of error to approximate what's happening within your within the population data. A confidence interval is an interval that surrounds your point estimate. Now, we say it's an interval surrounding because it's kind of like you have some wiggle room, if you will. So it's defined as your point estimate plus or minus the margin of error, regardless of which one it is. And the margin of error is defined by a formula. The confidence level is given by 1 minus alpha, which in chapter 8 we'll learn that alpha is referred to as a critical value or critical amount. So stay tuned for that. We'll spend more time talking about that in chapter 8. Alpha in general is the significance level of some kind. So the last couple of things we should say is what can we construct a confidence interval for? In the intro, we said, well, you can construct a confidence interval for anything population related, whether it's a proportion, so in other words, it's qualitative data, or for population means. And when you see a confidence interval, we said it's always x bar plus or minus the margin of error or the sample proportion, so that point estimate. There's a few different ways to write this, which I'd like to elaborate on now. When you are writing a confidence interval, you can just in terms of a mean, for example, we can visit proportions in another video. If you're writing your margin of error, this is technically an entire interval. So there's several different ways to approach that. We are estimating the population mean. So we can say that the margin of error is bounded on the upper side as your point estimate plus the margin of error. I'm sorry, your population mean is bounded on that side. And then it's bounded on the lower end by subtracting. So in other words, you are finding a lower boundary and an upper boundary such that the population mean is somewhere in between those bounds based on how confident you want to be. So if you choose a percent of confidence, that's what you're basing this off of. Another way that you could write this, and it's not as common, but would be interval notation. So something like this would be your subtracted piece, comma, your added piece. Either of those are perfectly acceptable for writing it. Keep in mind the goal is to express what the lower and the upper bounds are, so you should have one of these. In the next video, we will explore calculating a confidence interval when the estimate for sigma is known. So stay tuned for that.